The bell above Rodriguez military surplus chimed softly as Marcus Tank Rodriguez turned the key in the lock, officially opening for another day in San Antonio's industrial district. The October morning air carried the familiar scent of mesquite and exhaust from the nearby highway, mixed with the metallic tang of the train yard 2 blocks over. At 42, Marcus moved with the deliberate economy of motion that marked career soldiers. No wasted energy, every step purposeful. The store occupied a narrow building wedged between a tire shop and a shuttered restaurant, its green-painted facade weathered by Texas sun and summer storms. Inside, military gear lined every available surface. Tactical vests hanging from pegboard walls, rows of combat boots sorted by size, surplus uniforms folded in precise stacks. The organized chaos would have looked overwhelming to civilians, but Marcus knew the location of every item, from the vintage Vietnam-era field jackets to the modern plate carriers favored by security contractors. Marcus poured coffee from a pot that had seen better decades and settled behind the counter, opening the day's first customer transaction on his tablet. The morning ritual helped center him, providing structure that his VA counselor insisted was crucial for managing his PTSD. 3 years since his medical retirement from the Army, and he still woke at 0500 sharp, muscle memory stronger than any alarm clock. The first customer arrived before 8, a young veteran Marcus recognized from previous visits. The kid couldn't have been more than 25, with the slightly hollow look that came from too many sleepless nights and not enough good meals. His name was Danny, recently separated from the Marines, struggling to find his place in civilian life. "Morning, Tank," Danny said, using the nickname that had followed Marcus from his Special Forces days. "You got any work boots in size 10? Something that won't fall apart in a month?" Marcus studied the young man's worn sneakers, noting the duct tape reinforcing the sole. "Let me see what I've got in the back." He disappeared into the stockroom, returning with a pair of Belleville tactical boots, barely used. "Try these." Danny's eyes widened when he saw the boots. Quality leather, steel toe, easily worth $200 new. "How much?" "50, Marcus said, watching Danny's relief. The boots had cost him $30 at an estate sale, but the kid didn't need to know that. Marcus had learned to recognize the signs, the careful way Danny counted crumpled bills, the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of stress rather than caffeine, the way he glanced toward the door as if expecting trouble to follow him inside. "You eating regular?" Marcus asked quietly while Danny laced up the boots. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken understanding. Danny's shoulders tensed, pride warring with necessity. Marcus had been there. The transition period when military discipline collided with civilian chaos, when every day felt like walking point in unknown territory. "I'm getting by," Danny said finally. Marcus nodded, pulling a business card from beneath the register. "My buddy Luis runs a construction crew. They're hiring and he likes veterans. Tell him Tank sent you." He paused, meeting Danny's eyes. "The work's honest, and Luis pays fair. Show up on time, work hard, and you'll have steady income." Danny took the card with something approaching reverence. "Why are you doing this, Tank? You don't even know me." The question stirred memories Marcus kept carefully locked away. Faces of soldiers he'd led, brothers who hadn't made it home, the weight of responsibility that never truly left a leader's shoulders. In his dreams, he still heard their voices, still felt the crushing weight of decisions made in split seconds under enemy fire. "We look after our own," Marcus said simply. It was the same answer he'd given countless times, but it never got easier to say. Every veteran who walked through his door reminded him of someone from his past, someone he'd served with or commanded, or left behind. The morning proceeded with its usual rhythm, a collector searching for Korean War memorabilia, a security guard needing uniform patches, a teenager whose grandfather had served in Vietnam and wanted to understand the old man's stories through the artifacts he'd left behind. Marcus listened to each story, offered advice when asked, and slowly built the trust that made his store more than just a business. By noon, the temperature outside had climbed into the 80s, and Marcus propped open the front door to let air circulate. The lunch crowd from the nearby factories would arrive soon, workers who appreciated military surplus clothing for its durability and reasonable prices. He was organizing a shipment of tactical flashlights when movement across the street caught his attention. 3 men sat in a dark sedan, engine running despite the heat. They'd been there for 20 minutes, too long for casual observation. Marcus's trained eye catalogued details automatically. Tinted windows, temporary plates, the way they positioned the car for a quick exit. The driver kept checking his watch while the passenger studied the storefronts through binoculars. The prickle of awareness that had kept Marcus alive through 3 combat deployments whispered a warning. He moved away from the window, muscle memory taking over as he evaluated his store's defensive positions. Behind the counter, he kept a Mossberg 590 and his service pistol, both legal and properly registered. The tactical knowledge he'd acquired over 15 years of military service didn't fade with retirement. It just waited, dormant, for moments like this. Marcus reached for his phone to call the police, then hesitated. Years of therapy had taught him to question his instincts, to separate legitimate threats from PTSD-induced hypervigilance. Maybe they were just lost tourists, or private investigators on a surveillance job. Maybe his mind was creating patterns where none existed. But as he watched, the sedan's doors opened simultaneously, and 3 men emerged with the coordinated movement of a practiced team. They wore dark clothing despite the heat, and their body language spoke of violent intent. The lead man, tall and lean with prison tattoos visible on his neck, surveyed the street before nodding to his companions. Marcus's training kicked in fully. He locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, then moved to his defensive position behind the counter. Whatever was about to happen, Rodriguez's military surplus had just become a battleground, and Marcus Rodriguez, veteran of 12 years in Special Forces, former team leader who'd led men through the most dangerous missions the Army could devise, was ready to fight for his adopted home. The 3 men moved with predatory patience, splitting up to approach Marcus's store from different angles. Through the security monitor connected to his external cameras, a precaution that had seemed paranoid when he'd installed them, Marcus watched them execute a basic surveillance pattern. These weren't desperate junkies looking for easy cash. They moved like professionals. The leader, whom Marcus mentally designated Alpha, positioned himself across the street with a clear view of the front entrance. Beta, shorter and stockier with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, moved toward the alley that ran behind the building. Gamma, the youngest of the 3, approached from the south, using parked cars as cover. Marcus's breathing slowed automatically, his heart rate dropping into the controlled rhythm he'd learned during his years with the 5th Special Forces Group. The hypervigilance that plagued his daily life, the constant scanning for threats, the involuntary tactical assessments of every room he entered, suddenly had purpose again. For the first time in 3 years, the skills that haunted him felt like allies rather than burdens. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, keeping his voice calm and professional. "This is Marcus Rodriguez at 1247 Industrial Boulevard. I have 3 armed suspects conducting surveillance on my business. Appears to be preparation for robbery or assault. Sir, can you confirm they're armed?" the dispatcher asked. Through his monitor, Marcus watched Beta adjust something beneath his jacket, the unmistakable motion of checking a concealed weapon. "Confirmed. Request immediate police response. I'm a veteran with defensive capabilities, but I'd prefer to avoid confrontation. Units are en route. Stay on the line and remain in a secure location." Marcus ended the call. In his experience, en route could mean anywhere from 5 minutes to 20, and these men weren't going to wait for the cavalry. He needed to prepare for the likelihood that he'd be on his own. Moving with practiced efficiency, Marcus began transforming his store from a retail space into a defensive position. He pulled down the security gate over his front window, reinforced steel that he'd installed after a break-in attempt the previous year. The back door was solid oak with a deadbolt and security bar, but he pushed a heavy display case against it for additional reinforcement. The layout of his store provided natural advantages. The main sales floor was long and narrow, with limited sightlines that would force attackers to move through choke points. Displays of tactical gear provided concealment, while the raised platform behind his counter offered elevation and cover. Marcus had unconsciously arranged the space according to military principles, creating overlapping fields of fire and multiple fallback positions. From beneath the counter, he retrieved his Mossberg 590, a 12-gauge shotgun that had served him well during his civilian transition. 8 rounds of .00 buckshot, devastating at close range, but with limited penetration through walls, reducing the risk to neighboring businesses. His sidearm, a Sig Sauer P320 he'd carried during his final deployment, rode comfortable in its holster at his hip. The familiar weight of weapons in his hands brought unwanted memories flooding back. The mountains of Afghanistan, where he'd led a 12-man Special Forces A-team through operations that officially didn't exist. The weight of responsibility for lives under his command. The split-second decisions that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The faces of men who'd trusted him with their lives, some of whom had paid the ultimate price for that trust. Marcus shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. Danny, the young Marine who'd bought boots that morning, was probably just starting his first day at Luis's construction site. Mrs. Chen from the alterations shop next door would be working at her sewing machine, unaware of the danger developing outside. These people had become his community, his responsibility, and he wouldn't let them be hurt because of his past catching up with him. A sharp knock on his front door interrupted his preparations. Through the reinforced glass, Marcus could see Alpha standing casually, hands visible but positioned for quick access to concealed weapons. The man's body language projected false confidence, the practiced deception of someone used to intimidating victims into compliance. "We're closed," Marcus called out, his voice carrying the flat authority of command. "Come on, man, I just need some gear for my security job," Alpha replied, his tone friendly but with an underlying edge. "I can see you in there. 5 minutes, that's all I need." Marcus studied the man through his security camera feeds. Beta had moved into position behind the building, while Gamma was using the tire shop's dumpster as cover, cutting off potential escape routes. Classic L-shaped ambush pattern, designed to funnel targets into a kill zone. These men definitely had military or paramilitary training. "Sorry, family emergency," Marcus replied. "Come back tomorrow." Alpha's friendly mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the predator underneath. "Look, friend, I'm going to need you to open this door. We've got business to discuss, and it'd be better for everyone if we kept this civil." The threat was barely veiled now, confirming Marcus's assessment. He moved to his fallback position behind the counter, shotgun ready but not yet visible. Years of counterinsurgency operations had taught him to read situations like this, the escalation patterns, the moment when talking ended and violence began. "I said we're closed," Marcus called back, letting steel enter his voice. "Move along." Through his monitors, he watched Alpha gesture to his partners. The professional facade disappeared entirely as all three men converged on the storefront, no longer concerned with subtlety. Beta produced a crowbar from beneath his jacket, while Gamma pulled what looked like a modified police baton. Alpha reached into his waistband, revealing the grip of an automatic pistol. Marcus felt the familiar calm that had sustained him through countless firefights. His breathing deepened, his vision sharpened, and the background noise of traffic and machinery faded away. 3 hostiles, small unit tactics, confined space with civilians in adjacent buildings. Variables calculated automatically, contingencies flowing through his mind like water. He'd spent 12 years perfecting the art of violence in service to his country. Now, 3 years after hanging up his uniform, Marcus Rodriguez was about to discover whether retirement had dulled his edge, or if some skills never truly faded. The first impact against his security gate rang out like a bell, followed by Alpha's voice, no longer friendly. "Last chance, old man, open up or we'll open it for you." Marcus chambered around in his shotgun, the distinctive sound echoing through the store. In the sudden silence that followed, he heard sirens in the distance, still too far away to matter. "Wrong answer," he said quietly, and prepared for war. The security gate buckled under the third blow from Beta's crowbar, reinforced steel protesting against the assault. Marcus watched through his monitors as the 3 men worked with practiced efficiency, Alpha providing overwatch while Gamma used a small hydraulic jack to widen the gap Beta had created. They'd done this before, probably multiple times. The sirens were getting closer, but not close enough. Marcus estimated he had maybe 90 seconds before they breached his perimeter, and the police were still at least 3 minutes out. In combat, 3 minutes was an eternity, long enough for a small unit to be overrun, for hostages to be taken, for innocent people to die. Through the thin wall separating his store from Mrs. Chen's alterations shop, he could hear the steady hum of her sewing machine. She was probably working on the wedding dress that had been hanging in her window for weeks, completely unaware that death was forcing its way through the door next to hers. The thought of these animals hurting the elderly seamstress, who brought him homemade dumplings every Chinese New Year, made something cold and hard settle in Marcus's chest. A metallic screech announced the security gate's failure. The bottom corner bent upward, creating a gap large enough for a man to crawl through. Alpha immediately dropped to his hands and knees, pistol extended ahead of him as he prepared to enter. "Federal agents," Marcus shouted, hoping the lie might buy him precious seconds. "You're surrounded. Drop your weapons." Alpha paused, but only briefly. Through the gap, Marcus could see the man's scarred face split into a grin. "Nice try, Grandpa. We know exactly who you are. Just some broken-down soldier playing shopkeeper. This'll be over quick if you don't make it hard on yourself." The casual dismissal sparked something dangerous in Marcus's memory. He'd heard similar words before, whispered in Pashto by Taliban fighters, who'd underestimated the quiet American leading the patrol through their valley. Those fighters had learned too late that underestimating Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was a fatal mistake. Alpha squeezed through the gap, rising to a combat crouch with his weapon trained on the store interior. The pistol was a Glock 19, probably stolen, held with the sideways grip that marked him as someone who'd learned to shoot on the streets rather than on a range. Effective at close range, but lacking the precision that came from proper training. "I can see you back there, old man," Alpha called, advancing slowly between displays of tactical gear. "Come out peaceful, and maybe we just take what we came for. No need for anyone to get hurt." Marcus remained silent, letting his opponent's assumptions work against him. Alpha moved like someone used to intimidating civilians, confident but sloppy, relying on his weapon's psychological impact rather than proper tactics. He cleared corners inadequately, failed to check his six, and most importantly, he was advancing alone instead of waiting for his team to establish proper coverage. The mistake would cost him. Marcus rose from behind the counter like a spectre, the Mossberg's barrel centering on Alpha's chest before the intruder could react. "Drop it. Now." Alpha's eyes widened as he found himself staring down the business end of a 12-gauge shotgun. At 8 feet, the spread pattern would be roughly the size of a dinner plate. Impossible to miss, impossible to survive. For a heartbeat, Marcus saw recognition flicker across the man's face as he realized he'd catastrophically misjudged his target. "Easy, easy," Alpha said, but instead of dropping his weapon, he began to pivot toward cover behind a rack of military surplus jackets. A professional would have complied immediately, recognizing the hopelessness of his position. A street criminal, however, operated on different logic. Pride, desperation, and the mistaken belief that aggression could overcome tactical disadvantage. Marcus didn't hesitate. The Mossberg thundered in the confined space, 0-0 buckshot shredding the jacket display and catching Alpha in the right shoulder. The impact spun him around, his Glock flying across the store to clatter against the far wall. He went down hard, clutching his wounded arm and screaming curses that echoed off the concrete walls. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the air, mixing with the acrid scent of destroyed merchandise. Marcus cycled another round into the chamber, the mechanical sound cutting through Alpha's screams. Outside, he could hear Beta and Gamma shouting, their plans suddenly derailed by the reality that their easy target was shooting back. "Beta! Beta, what the hell happened?" Gamma's voice carried panic now, the carefully orchestrated robbery descending into chaos. Alpha writhed on the floor among scattered camouflage gear, his right arm hanging useless, but his eyes still burning with rage. "Son of a bitch got me! He's got a shotgun!" Marcus moved from behind the counter, keeping the Mossberg trained on his wounded prisoner, while his mind automatically shifted into combat mode. One hostile down but not neutralized, 2 more outside with unknown weapons and capabilities. The store's front entrance was compromised, but the breach was narrow, a funnel that would force the remaining attackers to enter one at a time. "You made a mistake coming here," Marcus said, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who'd delivered similar messages in darker places. "Last chance to walk away." The response came in the form of automatic weapons fire from outside, bullets punching through the weakened security gate and storming glass. Marcus dropped flat, pulling Alpha down with him, as rounds sparked off concrete and punched through merchandise displays. The sound was distinctive, 23 rounds from what sounded like an AR-15 variant. These men had come prepared for serious resistance. As quickly as it began, the gunfire stopped. Marcus could hear brass casings tinkling to the pavement outside, followed by urgent voices discussing their next move. They'd just escalated from robbery to attempted murder, crossing a line that would bring down the full weight of law enforcement. Desperate men made dangerous decisions. "Marcus, you in there?" The voice belonged to Officer Rivera from SAPD, someone Marcus recognized from the community policing meetings he'd attended. The cavalry had finally arrived. 3 suspects, Marcus called back, not moving from his defensive position. 1 wounded inside, 2 outside with automatic weapons. Civilian businesses adjacent. Watch your crossfire. The weight of command settled on his shoulders again as naturally as breathing. Squad leaders called out positions, coordinating their approach with the professional precision that separated police tactical units from the criminal amateurs they pursued. Marcus found himself automatically analyzing their deployment, offering suggestions born from years of leading similar operations in much more hostile territory. Alpha groaned beneath him, blood seeping through the man's fingers as he clutched his wounded shoulder. "You're a dead man," he gasped. "You know who you messed with. This ain't over." Marcus pressed the Mossberg's muzzle against Alpha's forehead, the steel cold against fevered skin. "It is for you," he said quietly. "Question is whether your friends are smart enough to surrender, or if they want to join you in the hospital." The answer came seconds later, in the form of another sustained burst of automatic fire, this time directed at the arriving police units. Marcus heard the distinctive crack of rounds passing overhead, followed by shouted commands as officers took cover behind their vehicles. The wounded criminal beneath him was no longer his primary concern. Outside, 2 desperate men with military-grade weapons were engaging police officers in a residential area, with innocent civilians caught in the potential crossfire. Mrs. Chen's sewing machine had fallen silent, hopefully because she'd taken shelter in her back room. But there were other businesses on the block, other people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when violence erupted. Marcus had spent his military career protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The uniform might be gone, but the responsibility remained. The gunfire outside intensified as Beta and Gamma found themselves trapped between Marcus's fortified store and the growing number of police units surrounding the block. Through his security monitors, Marcus watched the tactical situation develop with the practiced eye of someone who'd coordinated similar operations in hostile territory. "Officer Rivera," Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Former Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Special Forces. I've got eyes on both remaining suspects through my security system." There was a brief pause in the police chatter before Rivera's voice came back, tight with stress, but professional. "Copy that, Rodriguez. What's your assessment?" Marcus studied his monitors, cataloging details with automatic precision. 2 hostiles positioned behind the blue sedan at your 10 o'clock. One has an AR-15 with at least 2 magazines visible. The other appears to have a pistol and is carrying what looks like a breaching charge. They're discussing something, probably planning to blow a hole in the tire shop wall and flank you. The tactical knowledge flowed from him effortlessly, muscle memory of countless briefings in forward operating bases where intelligence meant the difference between successful missions and body bags. Alpha groaned beneath him, the wounded criminal's breathing growing more labored as shock set in. "Rodriguez, this is Sergeant Martinez, SWAT commander." A new voice crackled over the radio. "We've got units positioned on Industrial and Maple, but these guys are in a good defensive position. Can you maintain overwatch?" Marcus almost smiled despite the circumstances. They were asking him to provide reconnaissance and tactical support, exactly what he'd done for indigenous forces throughout his deployments in Afghanistan. The terminology might be different, but the fundamentals remained the same. Affirmative. Suspect Alpha is neutralized but breathing. I've got clear sight lines on the other 2 through multiple camera angles. He paused, studying the screen. Be advised, the one with the rifle keeps checking his watch. They might be working to a timeline. The implications hung heavy in the air. Criminals desperate enough to engage police in broad daylight rarely acted without compelling motivation. Either they were facing consequences worse than prison, or this robbery was part of something larger, a stepping stone to a bigger score that required specific timing. Beta suddenly broke from cover, sprinting toward the rear of Marcus's building with the explosive charge clutched in his hands. The man moved with surprising speed for his bulk, using parked cars and a dumpster for concealment as he attempted to flank the police perimeter. "Runner heading for my back door," Marcus transmitted, already moving. "Armed with explosives." He grabbed a set of zip-tie restraints from his tactical gear display and quickly secured Alpha's hands behind his back, ignoring the man's renewed curses. The wounded criminal wasn't going anywhere, but Marcus couldn't afford to leave him completely unguarded. From beneath the counter, he retrieved a small handheld radio, a civilian model he used for inventory coordination, but adequate for maintaining contact with the officers outside. The layout of his building worked in his favor. A narrow hallway connected the main store to a rear stockroom, with a reinforced door, providing access to the alley behind the building. Beta would need time to position his explosive charge, time that Marcus could use to establish an ambush position. He moved through the darkened hallway with the silent steps that had carried him through enemy territory, the Mossberg held in a low, ready position that wouldn't silhouette him against doorways. Behind him, Alpha's labored breathing grew fainter as distance and blood loss took their toll. The man would live, but he'd be out of action for the duration of this engagement. The stockroom was cramped but organized, filled with boxes of surplus equipment arranged in neat rows. Marcus positioned himself behind a stack of Kevlar helmets, creating a firing position that covered both the rear door and the single window that faced the alley. Through the glass he could see Beta approaching cautiously, the explosive device, probably a shaped charge designed for breaching doors, held ready for deployment. "SWAT, this is Rodriguez," Marcus whispered into his radio. "Suspect Beta is at my rear door with the explosive. I'm in position to neutralize him, but I need to know your positioning to avoid friendly fire." "Rodriguez, Sergeant Martinez, we've got units moving to contain the alley, but they're still 60 seconds out. If you've got a clear shot..." Marcus didn't need permission. Through the window he watched Beta kneel beside the reinforced door, carefully positioning the shaped charge against the steel frame. The man's concentration was absolute, his attention focused entirely on the technical challenge of breaching the barrier. It was the kind of tunnel vision that got soldiers killed in combat zones. The window wasn't designed to open, but the glass was standard safety grade, nothing that couldn't be overcome with proper technique. Marcus used the Mossberg's butt to punch out a section just large enough for the barrel, working quickly but quietly. Beta remained focused on his explosive device, unaware that death was taking aim at him from 20 feet away. "Drop the device and put your hands where I can see them," Marcus commanded, his voice carrying across the alley with unmistakable authority. Beta spun toward the sound, his hands instinctively moving toward the pistol at his waist. It was exactly the wrong response, a panicked reaction that transformed him from a potential prisoner into an active threat. Marcus had given him a chance, more consideration than he'd shown his victims, but the man's criminal instincts overrode any survival sense he might have possessed. The Mossberg spoke again, this time at closer range. The buckshot caught Beta's center mass, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the brick wall of the tire shop. The explosive device fell from nerveless fingers, its arming mechanism still safely disengaged. Beta slid down the wall, leaving a crimson trail on the weathered bricks. "Suspect Beta neutralized," Marcus reported, already scanning for the third member of the team. "Explosive device secured but not armed. Where's your third man?" The answer came in the form of engine noise, high-revved and growing more distant. Through his security cameras, Marcus watched Gamma abandon his position and sprint toward the dark sedan, apparently deciding that discretion was the better part of valor. The surviving criminal threw himself behind the wheel and accelerated hard, tires smoking as he fled the scene. "Runner in the dark sedan. Temporary plates," Marcus transmitted. "Last I saw him, he was heading south on Industrial toward the highway interchange." Police units immediately began coordinating pursuit, their radio chatter filling the airways as patrol cars repositioned to intercept the fleeing suspect. Marcus lowered his shotgun, the familiar post-combat exhaustion beginning to settle over him like a heavy blanket. The engagement was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. He made his way back to the front of the store, where Alpha lay zip-tied and semi-conscious among the scattered remains of military surplus merchandise. The man's breathing had stabilized, though his face was pale with blood loss. He'd lived to stand trial, which was more consideration than he'd planned to show his victims. Through the shattered security gate, Marcus could see Officer Rivera approaching with his weapon drawn, but lowered. Behind him, paramedics waited with a stretcher, ready to provide medical attention to the wounded criminal. The professional competence of the response impressed Marcus. These officers knew their business. "Clear," Marcus called out, setting his shotgun on the counter with the action open. One wounded suspect secured inside, one KIA in the rear alley, third suspect fled in vehicle as reported. Rivera stepped through the breach in the security gate, his eyes taking in the carnage with the expression of someone who'd seen violence before, but never quite got used to it. "Jesus, Rodriguez, when you said you were former military, you weren't kidding." Marcus said nothing, watching the paramedics work on Alpha with professional efficiency. The man would recover, would face charges for armed robbery and assault, would probably spend the next decade or more in federal prison. But he was alive, which meant Marcus had done his job correctly, neutralizing the threat while preserving life whenever possible. The weight of what had just happened was beginning to settle on him. For 20 minutes, he'd been Staff Sergeant Rodriguez again, tactical leader, protector of innocence, a soldier at war. Now, as the adrenaline faded and civilian reality reasserted itself, he was just Marcus, the shop owner, who'd killed a man in his stockroom and wounded another in his store. Mrs. Chen appeared in her doorway, her elderly face creased with concern. "Marcus, are you hurt?" He managed a smile for the woman who'd become like a grandmother to him. "I'm fine, Mrs. Chen. Just some trouble with bad customers. You should go back inside until the police finish up." She nodded, but not before pressing something into his hands, a thermos of tea that was still warm. "For later," she said simply, then disappeared back into her shop. Marcus stood in the wreckage of his store, surrounded by police and paramedics and the detritus of violence, holding a thermos of tea from an elderly seamstress who cared enough about him to brave a crime scene. The contrast between the brutality he'd just survived and the simple kindness of human connection was almost overwhelming. In Afghanistan, the aftermath of firefights had been different: immediate tactical debriefs, casualty reports, preparation for the next mission. Here there would be investigations, paperwork, questions about his use of force and the legality of his actions. The bureaucracy of civilian law enforcement, designed to ensure justice, but often feeling like an additional punishment for those who'd done nothing wrong. Sergeant Martinez approached, a compact man with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Rodriguez, hell of a thing you did here. Mind if we talk?" The interview room at San Antonio Police Department's Central Patrol Division smelled like burnt coffee and industrial disinfectant, with fluorescent lights that flickered just enough to be annoying. Marcus sat across from Detective Lisa Hernandez, a woman in her 40s, whose sharp eyes missed nothing as she reviewed the preliminary report from the shooting incident. 3 hours had passed since the firefight at his store, and the adrenaline had long since faded, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. "So let me get this straight," Detective Hernandez said, looking up from her notes. 3 armed suspects attempt to rob your military surplus store. You wound one with a shotgun, kill another in your stockroom, and provide tactical support to responding officers during the incident, all while maintaining perfect adherence to Texas self-defense laws. Marcus nodded, sipping from a foam cup filled with coffee that could have dissolved paint. "That's accurate. And you're telling me you had no prior knowledge of these men, no history, no grudges, nothing that would suggest this was personal rather than random?" "I'd never seen them before today." Marcus met her gaze steadily. "Detective, I run a quiet business helping veterans and collectors find gear they need. I'm not involved in anything that would attract that kind of attention." Hernandez leaned back in her chair, studying him with the intensity of someone who'd spent years reading people's lies. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, retired Special Forces, 12 years of service, 3 deployments to Afghanistan, decorated multiple times for valor under fire, medical retirement due to PTSD and traumatic brain injury sustained during an IED attack in Helmand Province." The clinical recitation of his military record felt like hearing someone else's story. Those words on paper couldn't capture the weight of carrying wounded soldiers under enemy fire, the crushing responsibility of leading men into situations where split-second decisions meant life or death, or the guilt that came with surviving when better men didn't. "Your service record is impressive," Hernandez continued. "Commendations for leadership, tactical excellence, and what your commanding officers described as exceptional ability to adapt and overcome in fluid combat situations. But what really caught my attention was this." She slid a folder across the table, revealing photographs that made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. Satellite images of a remote valley in Afghanistan, aerial shots of a compound surrounded by mountains, and finally a group photo of 12 men in desert camouflage, standing beside a shot-up Humvee. "Operation Red Wing Echo," Hernandez said quietly. "Classified at the time, but enough details have been declassified that I was able to piece together the basics. Your A-team was tasked with tracking down a high-value target who'd been coordinating attacks on supply convoys. Intelligence suggested he was operating from a compound in the Spingar Mountains. Marcus stared at the photographs, memories flooding back like water through a broken dam. He could smell the dust and diesel fuel, hear the crackle of radio communications, feel the weight of his rifle, and the responsibility for 11 lives under his command. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had led his team into that valley with confidence born of training and experience, convinced that superior tactics and firepower would carry the day. He'd been wrong. The operation went sideways, Hernandez continued, her voice gentler now. Intelligence was compromised. Instead of finding one high-value target, your team walked into a coordinated ambush by approximately 40 insurgents. You were cut off from extraction and surrounded in hostile territory. Detective, I'm not sure what this has to do with today's incident, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. The connection was already forming in his mind, pieces of a puzzle he'd hoped would stay buried. Bear with me, Rodriguez. Your team was trapped for 18 hours before air support could reach you. During that time, you coordinated defensive positions, managed casualty evacuation under fire, and according to multiple witness statements, personally carried 3 wounded soldiers to safety, while under continuous enemy fire. By the time rescue arrived, you'd eliminated an estimated 25 enemy combatants and saved the lives of every man under your command. The official version made it sound heroic. The reality had been 18 hours of hell, watching good men bleed while he made impossible decisions about ammunition conservation and medical priorities. Every choice had carried the weight of lives in the balance, every mistake measured in American blood. The interesting part, Hernandez said, pulling out another set of photos, is what happened to the insurgents who planned that ambush. Over the next 6 months, 14 high-value targets associated with the attack were eliminated in a series of precision strikes. Someone provided extremely detailed intelligence about their locations, habits, and security arrangements. Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. Those operations had been conducted by other units, but the intelligence had come from his team's after-action reports. He'd provided everything he knew about the enemy fighters they'd engaged, their tactics, their apparent training level. It had been part of the healing process, channeling his anger into something productive. The point is, Staff Sergeant, you've tangled with some very dangerous people. People with long memories and international connections. What if today's attack wasn't random? What if someone from your past decided to settle an old score? The possibility had occurred to Marcus during the firefight, but he'd pushed it aside in favor of more immediate concerns. Now, sitting in the harsh light of the interview room, he was forced to confront the implications. If today's attack was connected to his military service, then Mrs. Chen and his other neighbors had been put at risk because of his past. The quiet life he'd built was compromised, and everyone around him was a potential target. Alpha, the wounded suspect, said something before he lost consciousness, Hernandez continued, consulting her notes. He knows who he messed with. Not, you know who we are or you're in trouble now. He was talking about you specifically, Rodriguez, like they'd done research, knew exactly who they were dealing with. Marcus set down his coffee cup, his hand steadier than he felt. What's his condition? Stable but critical. Multiple pellet wounds to the shoulder and chest, significant blood loss. He'll live, but he's going to be in the hospital for a while. And when he's ready to talk, I'm hoping he'll tell us who sent him. A knock on the interview room door interrupted them. Officer Rivera poked his head in, his expression grim. Detective? Sorry to interrupt, but we've got an update on the fleeing suspect. Hernandez waved him in. What have you got, Rivera? Highway Patrol found the sedan abandoned near the I-10 interchange, completely torched. Fire department says it was definitely arson. Somebody used an accelerant to make sure nothing survived. No prints, no DNA, no evidence. Marcus wasn't surprised. Professional criminals covered their tracks, and the coordinated nature of the attack suggested these men were more than common thieves. The abandoned car was another piece of evidence pointing toward a larger organization, people with resources and experience in avoiding law enforcement. There's more, Rivera continued. The vehicle was reported stolen 3 days ago from a rental lot in Houston, same rental company that's been linked to several other crimes involving stolen vehicles. Someone's running a pipeline, stealing cars from rental lots and distributing them to criminal groups across Texas. Organized crime, Hernandez muttered, making notes. Rodriguez, this is looking less like a random robbery and more like a targeted operation. Someone wanted you specifically, and they were willing to invest significant resources to get to you. Marcus thought about the young Marine, Danny, who'd bought boots that morning. The kid was probably working construction right now, building something positive with his life, unaware that his friendly neighborhood surplus store owner was apparently marked for death by unknown enemies. The contrast between Danny's hopeful future and Marcus's violent past felt like a betrayal of everything he'd tried to become. "I need to know about your enemies, Rodriguez," Hernandez said. "Not just from Afghanistan, but from your entire military career. Anyone who might have the resources and motivation to track you down 3 years after your retirement. Anyone who might see you as a threat worth eliminating." The list was longer than Marcus wanted to admit. 12 years in special forces had put him in contact with terrorists, arms dealers, corrupt officials, and criminal organizations across 3 continents. Most of them were dead or in prison, but some had survived, and some had very long memories. The nature of covert operations meant that many of his enemies didn't even know his real name, but facial recognition technology and determined investigation could overcome such obstacles. "I'll need time to think about it," Marcus said finally. "There are operational security considerations, classified information that I can't discuss without proper clearance." Hernandez nodded, understanding the limitations that came with military service. "Fair enough. But Rodriguez, until we figure out who's behind this, you're a target. These people found you once and they'll probably try again. You need to consider your options. Protective custody, relocation, or what?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "Or you accept that the war followed you home," she said quietly, "and you prepare to fight it on your own terms." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Marcus had spent 3 years trying to be a civilian, trying to heal from the wounds that war had carved into his soul. But some wounds never fully healed, and some wars never truly ended. The sun was setting over San Antonio by the time Marcus was released from police custody, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him uncomfortably of muzzle flashes against twilight. His store remained sealed behind crime scene tape, the shattered security gate and bullet-scarred walls serving as reminders that his quiet civilian life had just exploded into fragments. Danny was waiting for him in the parking lot, still wearing work clothes covered in concrete dust from his first day at Luis's construction site. The young Marine looked older somehow, his face bearing the weight of knowledge that safety was an illusion and violence could erupt anywhere, anytime. "Tank," Danny said, falling into step beside him. "Heard about what happened. Luis let us knock off early when the news broke." Marcus wasn't surprised. The Hispanic community in San Antonio was tight-knit, and news traveled fast. By now, everyone in the neighborhood would know about the shooting, though the details would be filtered through speculation and rumor. Some would paint him as a hero, others would wonder what kind of trouble he'd brought to their quiet street. "Oh, you shouldn't be here, kid," Marcus said, scanning the parking lot automatically for potential threats. "If this was targeted, anyone associated with me could be at risk." Danny's laugh was bitter. "Tank, I've been at risk since I got back from Helmand. PTSD, unemployment, no money, no prospects. At least your kind of trouble I know how to handle." They walked in comfortable silence toward Marcus's pickup truck, a battered Ford F-150 that had seen better decades but still ran reliably. The familiarity of the vehicle was comforting, a connection to the simple life he'd built brick by brick over 3 years of civilian existence. "Luis wants to see you," Danny said as they reached the truck. "He's got some ideas about security, temporary work while you get your store sorted out. Said to tell you it's family business now." Marcus felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. Luis Hernandez, no relation to Detective Hernandez, was a former Navy Seabee who'd built a successful construction business by hiring veterans and treating them like family. The man had never asked about Marcus's past, never pushed for details about his service or his medical retirement. He'd simply accepted him as a brother in arms and offered help when it was needed. "Where is he?" Marcus asked. "His place. Said to bring you by whenever you were ready." The drive to Luis's house took them through neighborhoods that Marcus had grown to love over the past 3 years. Tree-lined streets where kids played soccer in front yards, family-owned restaurants that served food made with recipes passed down through generations. Small businesses that formed the backbone of communities built on mutual support and shared values. Now he found himself analyzing potential ambush sites and escape routes, his trained eye cataloging the tactical advantages and disadvantages of familiar territory. The paranoia that had plagued his early civilian years was back in full force, turning every shadow into a potential threat and every passing car into a surveillance vehicle. Luis's house was a modest ranch-style home with a well-maintained lawn and a driveway that held more pickup trucks than a contractor's convention. Light spilled from the windows, and Marcus could hear the sound of multiple conversations in Spanish and English, punctuated by occasional laughter. It sounded like a gathering, which made him hesitate. "Go on," Danny urged. "They're waiting for you." The front door opened before Marcus could knock, revealing Luis himself, a stocky man in his 50s with calloused hands and intelligent eyes that had seen their share of combat zones. Behind him, Marcus could see at least a dozen other men, all veterans by their bearing, all watching him with expressions of concern and solidarity. "Marcus," Luis said, pulling him into an embrace that smelled of sawdust and honest sweat. "Gracias a Dios you're safe, hermano. Come in, we need to talk." The living room had been rearranged to accommodate the gathering, with chairs and folding tables, creating a space that felt more like a briefing room than a family home. Marcus recognized most of the faces, veterans from different branches and different wars, united by the shared experience of service and the challenges of civilian transition. There was Rodriguez, a former Army Ranger who ran a security consulting business; Martinez, an ex-Marine who'd become a paramedic; Thompson, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant who worked as a machinist, and half a dozen others whose stories Marcus knew in fragments. They'd all struggled with the transition from military to civilian life, had all found ways to build new purposes from the wreckage of old wars. "Sit down, Marcus," Luis said, gesturing to a chair that had been positioned where everyone could see him. "We heard about what happened today. Want to tell us your side of the story?" For the second time that day, Marcus found himself recounting the events at his store, but this audience was different. These men understood the split-second decisions, the weight of command responsibility, the brutal calculus of violence. They didn't need explanations about tactical positioning or rules of engagement. They'd all been there themselves. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Finally, Rodriguez spoke up. Sounds like they knew exactly who they were dealing with, did research, planned the attack, brought the right equipment for the job. "That's not random crime, that's an operation." "Agreed," said Martinez, "and if they found you once, they'll try again. Question is, what do we do about it?" Marcus looked around the room at faces marked by experience and hardship, men who'd volunteered to serve their country and paid prices that civilians couldn't understand. They were offering to stand with him, to put themselves at risk for a brotherhood that transcended individual safety. "This isn't your fight," Marcus said. "I appreciate the support, but I won't put you and your families in danger because of my past." Luis leaned forward, his expression serious. "Marcus, when I came back from Iraq, I was lost. Drinking too much, fighting with my wife, couldn't hold a job. You know what saved me? This community, these brothers. We don't abandon family, and your family." Thompson nodded agreement. "We've all got skills, Marcus. Security, surveillance, intelligence gathering, medical support. Between us, we've got everything you need to stay alive and figure out who's behind this. Plus," Rodriguez added with a grin, "it's been boring as hell being a civilian. Little excitement might be good for us." Despite everything, Marcus found himself smiling. These men were volunteering for a war they didn't understand against enemies they couldn't identify, simply because one of their own was in trouble. It was the same spirit that had carried them through combat deployments, the unbreakable bond that made military units more than the sum of their parts. "What did you have in mind?" Marcus asked. Luis pulled out a notebook filled with sketches and lists. "First, we get you somewhere safe while we assess the threat. Thompson's got a cabin up in the hill country, isolated, defensible, off the grid. You can lay low there while we gather intelligence. Second," Rodriguez continued, "we put together a protection detail, rotating shifts, armed and trained, watching for surveillance or follow-up attacks. These guys came after you in daylight on a busy street. They're not worried about witnesses or consequences." Martinez tapped the notebook. "Third, we use our resources to identify the threat. I've got contacts in law enforcement. Rodriguez knows people in the intelligence community, and Luis has connections with veteran networks across the state. Someone knows something about who's after you." Marcus felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders, but this time it was different. These weren't soldiers under his orders. They were brothers offering their support freely, understanding the risks and accepting them anyway. The responsibility was shared, the burden distributed among men who'd earned the right to stand together. "There's something else," Marcus said, decision crystallizing in his mind. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Full operational security, proper intelligence gathering, professional execution. These people came after me in my neighborhood, put innocent civilians at risk. They crossed a line. He looked around the room, meeting each man's eyes in turn. I spent 12 years hunting people like this in Afghanistan. Now they've brought the fight to my home, threatened my community, put people I care about in danger. If they want a war, I'll give them one they'll never forget. The nods around the room were grim but determined. They'd all left the military, but the military had never really left them. In trying to eliminate Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, his enemies had awakened something much more dangerous, a brotherhood of warriors with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Luis closed his notebook with a sharp snap. All right then, let's go to war. Thompson's cabin in the hill country sat on 40 acres of limestone ridges and cedar breaks, accessible only by a winding dirt road that would funnel any unwanted visitors into a natural kill zone. The property had been in his family for 3 generations, originally a hunting lodge that he'd converted into a secure retreat after his retirement from the Air Force. Solar panels provided power, a deep, well-supplied water, and strategic sight lines covered every approach. Marcus stood on the wraparound porch at dawn, coffee steaming in the cool morning air as he studied the terrain with a tactical eye. The elevation provided commanding views of the valley below, while the dense cedar growth offered concealment and multiple escape routes. It was exactly the kind of defensive position he would have chosen for a forward operating base in hostile territory. "Sleep any better?" Rodriguez asked, joining him on the porch. The former ranger had drawn first watch, spending the night in the observation post Thompson had constructed in the barn's hayloft. "Some," Marcus lied. The nightmares had been worse than usual, fragments of Afghanistan mixing with yesterday's violence in a kaleidoscope of gunfire and blood. He'd woken every few hours, reaching for weapons that weren't there, listening for sounds that existed only in his memory. "Martinez is on his way up with coffee and intelligence," Rodriguez said, settling into a wooden chair that creaked under his weight. "Says he's got some interesting information from his contacts in law enforcement." Through the valley, Marcus could see dust rising from the access road, announcing the arrival of their intelligence officer. Martinez drove like he'd done everything else in his military career, fast, efficient, and with complete disregard for unnecessary risks. His pickup truck bounced over the rough terrain at speeds that would have made civilian drivers reconsider their life choices. "Any word on the wounded suspect?" Marcus asked. "Still in intensive care, still not talking. But Detective Hernandez says they've identified him through fingerprints. Career criminal named Vincent Alpha Morales, with priors for armed robbery, assault, and weapons charges. Did a stretch in Huntsville, got out 8 months ago." Marcus filed the information away, adding it to the growing profile of his attackers. Professional criminals, recently released from prison, with access to military-grade weapons and intelligence about his background. The pattern suggested organization, resources, and careful planning. Martinez's truck pulled up in front of the cabin, followed by a second vehicle carrying Luis and 2 other veterans Marcus recognized from the previous night's gathering. They moved with the purposeful efficiency of a military unit, establishing security positions and unloading equipment with practiced coordination. "Gentlemen," Luis called out, hauling a case of communications equipment up the porch steps. "Time for our first operational briefing." The cabin's living room had been transformed into a command center overnight, with maps, photographs, and intelligence reports covering every available surface. Thompson had installed multiple monitors connected to security cameras positioned around the property, while Rodriguez had set up a weapons cleaning station in one corner. It looked like every safe house Marcus had ever operated from, functional and focused on the mission at hand. Martinez opened a folder thick with police reports and surveillance photographs. Vincent Morales, age 34, lifelong criminal with connections to several organized crime groups in Houston and Dallas. But here's where it gets interesting. His cellmate at Huntsville was a guy named Dmitry Volkov, Russian national with suspected ties to international arms trafficking. He spread out a series of mugshots and surveillance photos, showing a man with Slavic features and the dead eyes of someone who'd seen too much violence. Volkov was serving time for weapons charges, but the FBI suspected he was just the tip of the iceberg, part of a larger network moving military hardware from Eastern Europe into the United States. Marcus studied the photos, recognition tickling the back of his mind. The face was familiar, but not from civilian life. This was someone from his military past, a ghost from operations that officially didn't exist. "There's more," Martinez continued. "Volkov was released 2 weeks ago, same day that a shipment of military weapons disappeared from a National Guard depot in Oklahoma. Coincidence? I don't think so." Thompson looked up from his surveillance monitors. "So we've got Russian arms dealers, stolen military weapons, and a coordinated attack on a retired Special Forces soldier. This is starting to look like something bigger than a simple revenge operation." Luis nodded grimly. "The question is, what do they want with Marcus specifically? If this was just about eliminating a threat, they would have used a sniper or a car bomb. This felt like they wanted him alive." The observation sent a chill down Marcus's spine. He'd assumed the attack was meant to kill him, but Luis was right. The tactics suggested capture rather than assassination. 3 men with automatic weapons could have eliminated him from a distance, but instead, they'd chosen a close-quarters assault that maximized their own risk. "They wanted information," Marcus said, the pieces falling into place. "Something I know from my military service, something valuable enough to risk a daylight operation in a populated area." Rodriguez leaned forward. "What kind of information would be worth that level of risk?" Marcus closed his eyes, forcing himself to dive back into memories he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. Operation Red Wing Echo had been more than just a failed ambush. It had been part of a larger intelligence-gathering mission, targeting arms smuggling networks that supplied insurgents throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan. "We weren't just hunting one high-value target," Marcus said finally. "We were mapping an entire smuggling network, routes, contacts, financial connections, storage facilities. The intelligence we gathered led to dozens of follow-up operations over the next 2 years. And some of those networks had connections to Russian arms dealers," Martinez added, consulting his notes. "The DEA has been tracking similar operations in Mexico and Central America, using the same routes and methods to move weapons into the United States." Thompson pulled up a map on one of his monitors, marking locations with red pins. If someone wanted to restart those operations, they'd need detailed intelligence about how the networks operated, information that might be locked away in classified military files. "Or in the head of the soldier who helped take them down," Luis said quietly. The implications were staggering. If Volkov and his associates were trying to rebuild the arms smuggling networks that Marcus had helped destroy in Afghanistan, they would need detailed intelligence about how those operations had functioned. Personnel rosters, financial structures, transportation routes, information that existed in classified databases and in the memories of the soldiers who'd conducted the operations. "They're not the only ones who'd want that information," Rodriguez observed. "Competitors, law enforcement, intelligence agencies, there are a lot of parties who'd pay good money for insights into international arms trafficking." Marcus felt the weight of his past settling around him like a shroud. He'd thought his war was over when he'd retired from the military, but wars had a way of following soldiers home. The enemies he'd made in distant mountains were now operating in his neighborhood, threatening the people he'd come to care about. "There's something else," Martinez said, pulling out another set of photographs. "Detective Hernandez got these from a surveillance camera near your store, taken 3 days before the attack. The photos showed the same dark sedan that had been used in the robbery attempt, but this time it was parked outside the VA medical center, where Marcus received his PTSD counseling. A figure in dark clothing stood beside the vehicle, using what appeared to be a telephoto camera to photograph people entering and leaving the building. They were conducting surveillance," Marcus said, studying the images. "Mapping my routine, identifying associates, looking for vulnerabilities, which means they know about your medical appointments, your treatment schedule, probably your therapist's name and home address," Luis said. "These people did their homework, Marcus. They know everything about your civilian life." The violation felt worse than the physical attack. His therapy sessions were supposed to be a safe space where he could confront the demons that followed him home from war. Now even that sanctuary had been compromised, turned into another source of vulnerability by people who saw his pain as a tactical advantage. Marcus's phone buzzed with an incoming call. Detective Hernandez's name appeared on the screen, and he answered immediately. "Rodriguez," he said. "Marcus, thank God." Hernandez's voice was tight with stress. "We need to talk, and it can't wait. Volkov didn't just disappear, he's dead. Someone put 2 bullets in his head and dumped the body in Buffalo Bayou. But before he died, he made a phone call to a number we've been monitoring as part of a federal investigation. Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach. What kind of investigation? The kind that involves Homeland Security, the DEA, and people with badges who don't give their real names, Hernandez said grimly. Marcus, I think you've stumbled into something much bigger than a simple revenge operation. These people aren't just criminals. They're part of an ongoing national security investigation. The phone went silent as Marcus processed the implications. He'd spent 3 years trying to be a civilian, trying to heal from the wounds that war had carved into his soul. But some wounds never healed, and some wars never ended. They just found new battlegrounds. The meeting location was a truck stop on Interstate 35, 20 miles south of San Antonio, chosen for its anonymity and multiple exit routes. Marcus sat in Rodriguez's pickup truck, studying the federal agents who'd arrived 30 minutes early to establish their own security perimeter. 3 black SUVs, multiple personnel with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement, and enough firepower to start a small war. I don't like this, Rodriguez muttered, adjusting the concealed camera he'd clipped to his shirt collar. Too many variables, too much we don't know about their agenda. Marcus nodded, though part of him was relieved to see professional operators taking the threat seriously. The federal response suggested that his situation was connected to something larger, more dangerous than a simple revenge operation by disgruntled criminals. Detective Hernandez emerged from the lead SUV, accompanied by 2 people Marcus didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s with the sharp eyes of an intelligence analyst, and a younger man whose nervous energy marked him as someone still new to the dangerous game they all played. Rodriguez, Hernandez called out, approaching their truck. Thanks for coming. I know this isn't exactly standard procedure. Marcus climbed out of the pickup, automatically scanning the terrain for potential threats. The truck stop was busy enough to provide cover for surveillance, but isolated enough that a firefight wouldn't immediately endanger civilians. Professional choice of venue. Marcus Rodriguez, the woman said, extending her hand. I'm Agent Sarah Chen, DEA. This is Agent David Park, Homeland Security. We need to discuss your connection to an ongoing federal investigation. Agent Chen led them to a corner booth, inside the truck stop's restaurant, a location that provided privacy while maintaining visibility of the parking lot. Park positioned himself where he could watch the entrance, his hand never straying far from the weapon concealed beneath his jacket. Before we begin, Chen said, sliding a folder across the table, I need to confirm your security clearance status and get your agreement to maintain operational security regarding everything we're about to discuss. Marcus opened the folder, revealing documents that made his blood run cold. Satellite photographs of the compound in Afghanistan, where his team had been ambushed, personnel files for every member of his A-team, and detailed intelligence reports about the arms smuggling networks they'd helped dismantle. Operation Red Wing Echo was more successful than you were told at the time, Chen said quietly. The intelligence your team gathered led to the disruption of a smuggling network that was moving over $50 million worth of weapons annually. We're talking about advanced military hardware, night vision equipment, encrypted communications gear, anti-aircraft missiles. Park leaned forward, his voice tense with urgency. The problem is, someone's trying to restart those operations. Over the past 6 months, we've seen a dramatic increase in military-grade weapons appearing on the black market. Same sources, same transportation routes, same financial networks that your team helped identify. Marcus studied the documents, recognizing locations and personnel from his nightmares. The remote valleys where his team had conducted reconnaissance, the faces of insurgents they'd tracked and eliminated, the complex web of relationships that connected arms dealers from Peshawar to Caracas. Dmitry Volkov was our inside source, Chen continued. He'd been working with us for 2 years, providing intelligence about Russian involvement in international arms trafficking. When he was murdered 3 days ago, we lost our best insight into the network's current operations. But before he died, Park added, Volkov told us that someone had hired him to gather intelligence about American military personnel who'd been involved in disrupting smuggling operations, specifically Special Forces soldiers who'd operated in Afghanistan between 2018 and 2021. The time frame covered Marcus's final deployment, the operation that had ended with his medical evacuation and retirement. He'd led dozens of missions during that period, each one designed to gather intelligence about enemy networks and eliminate high-value targets. How many other soldiers are on this list? Marcus asked. Chen hesitated before answering. 17 names initially, but over the past 8 months, 6 of those soldiers have died in what appeared to be unrelated incidents. Car accidents, hunting accidents, apparent suicides, all ruled accidental or self-inflicted by local law enforcement. The implications were staggering. If someone was systematically eliminating Special Forces veterans who possessed knowledge about arms smuggling networks, then Marcus's attack wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger operation designed to eliminate witnesses and recover classified intelligence. "We believe the person behind this is someone called the Broker," Park said, sliding another set of photographs across the table. "Real name unknown, nationality uncertain, but responsible for coordinating arms deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually." The surveillance photos showed a figure in expensive clothing, always photographed from a distance or at angles that obscured facial features. Male, probably middle-aged, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. But the images were frustratingly unclear, providing hints rather than identification. "The Broker operates through intermediaries and cutouts," Chen explained. "He never handles weapons directly, never meets clients face-to-face, never leaves any evidence that could be traced back to him. But our intelligence suggests he's planning something big, a weapons deal that would make his previous operations look like garage sales." Marcus leaned back in the booth, processing the information. "And you think the intelligence from Operation Red Wing Echo is connected to this deal?" "We know it is," Park said grimly. "Volkov's final communication mentioned specific code names and locations that appeared in your team's after-action reports. Someone has access to classified military intelligence, and they're using it to rebuild the same networks you helped destroy." Detective Hernandez had been quiet during the federal briefing, but now she leaned forward with a question that cut to the heart of Marcus's concerns. "What about protection for Rodriguez and the other soldiers on this list? If they're being systematically targeted—" "That's complicated," Chen admitted. "Officially, we can't provide protective custody for civilians based on their military service records. Unofficially, we're hoping that Mr. Rodriguez might be willing to help us identify the Broker and disrupt his operations." The request hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. They weren't just asking for his cooperation. They were asking him to become bait in a trap designed to catch an international arms dealer who'd already murdered at least 6 American veterans. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus asked. Park glanced around the restaurant before answering. "We want to set up a controlled operation. Use your knowledge of the smuggling networks to identify potential targets for the Broker's next operation. Then, position assets to intercept the deal when it goes down." "In other words," Rodriguez said, speaking for the first time since the briefing began, "you want Marcus to paint a target on his back and wait for professional killers to come after him." Chen's expression was apologetic but determined. "Mr. Rodriguez, 6 American soldiers are dead, and more are at risk. The Broker's next operation could put military-grade weapons in the hands of terrorist organizations, drug cartels, or domestic extremist groups. We need your help to stop him." Marcus stared out the restaurant window at the traffic flowing along Interstate 35. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that international arms dealers were operating in their midst. The peaceful civilian existence he'd built was already shattered. His quiet store transformed into a crime scene. His neighbors put at risk by enemies from his past. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. He'd taken an oath to defend his country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That oath didn't expire with retirement, and the threat was real whether he acknowledged it or not. "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked. Chen smiled grimly. "Everything you remember about the arms smuggling networks in Afghanistan. Names, locations, financial connections, operational methods. We're going to use that intelligence to predict the Broker's next move, and then we're going to be waiting for him." Park pulled out a secure tablet, its screen displaying a map of the southwestern United States dotted with red markers. "These are locations where military weapons have appeared on the black market over the past 6 months. We think the Broker is using the same transportation routes that were disrupted during your deployment." Marcus studied the map, recognition dawning as he identified patterns that matched intelligence from his military service. Border crossing points, storage facilities, distribution networks, all connected by routes he'd helped map during countless reconnaissance missions in Afghanistan. "There's going to be another attack," Marcus said, certainty settling over him like armor. The broker needs more intelligence than what he got from the other soldiers. He's going to come after me personally, probably with a larger team and better planning. We're counting on it, Chen said. When he does, we'll be ready. Marcus looked at Rodriguez, seeing his own thoughts reflected in the former ranger's grim expression. They were about to volunteer for a mission that would put them squarely in the crosshairs of professional killers, with no guarantee of survival and minimal support from official sources. It felt exactly like every other mission they'd volunteered for during their military careers, dangerous, necessary, and absolutely essential for protecting people who'd never know their names. "All right," Marcus said. "Let's go to war." The abandoned warehouse district on San Antonio's east side provided the perfect backdrop for a federal sting operation, with enough isolated buildings and industrial infrastructure to stage a convincing arms deal while maintaining containment. Marcus stood in the command trailer, studying surveillance monitors that showed every approach to the target building where they'd established their fictional weapons cache. 3 weeks had passed since his meeting with the federal agents, 3 weeks of careful preparation and intelligence analysis that had led them to this moment. The broker had taken the bait. Intercepted communications suggested he was planning a major acquisition that would require the specific intelligence only Marcus possessed about Afghan smuggling routes. "Radio check," Agent Chen's voice crackled through his earpiece. "All units report status." Marcus keyed his microphone, using the call sign they'd assigned him for the operation. "Overwatch 1, position secure, full visibility on target building and surrounding area." Around the industrial complex, federal agents and SAPD tactical officers reported their readiness from concealed positions. The trap was elaborate and multi-layered, designed to capture not just the broker's operational team, but the man himself when he arrived to personally oversee the intelligence extraction. Rodriguez's voice came through the secure channel from his position in an adjacent building. "Overwatch 2 ready. No movement on the north approach, but I've got eyes on 2 suspicious vehicles that have been circling the area for the past hour." "Copy that," Chen replied. "Intel suggests the broker likes to conduct personal reconnaissance before committing to major operations. Stay alert. This could be him conducting final surveillance." Marcus checked his equipment one more time. Body armor concealed beneath civilian clothing, concealed weapons, encrypted communications gear, and most importantly, a modified tablet containing the intelligence that the broker wanted. The device was genuine military hardware, loaded with carefully curated information that would be valuable enough to justify the risk, but not sensitive enough to compromise ongoing operations. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus would pose as a disgruntled veteran, willing to sell classified intelligence to the highest bidder, using his military surplus store as a front for the transaction. When the broker's team arrived to make the exchange, federal agents would be waiting to spring the trap. But Marcus had learned during 12 years of military service that no plan survived contact with the enemy unchanged. The broker hadn't built an international arms-dealing empire by walking into obvious traps, and the professional precision of the previous attack suggested he had resources and experience that could threaten even a well-planned federal operation. "Movement on the south approach," Thompson's voice reported from his overwatch position on a water tower that provided commanding views of the entire industrial complex. 3 vehicles, black SUVs, moving in tactical formation. Through his binoculars, Marcus could see the convoy approaching with the coordinated precision of a military unit. The lead vehicle peeled off to establish an overwatch position, while the other 2 continued toward the target building, their occupants invisible behind tinted windows. "This is it," Chen said over the radio. "All units maintain position until we have confirmation of the broker's presence. Rodriguez, you're live in 30 seconds. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself into the mindset of a corrupt veteran willing to betray his country for money. The role went against every instinct he'd developed during his military career, but operational necessity demanded convincing deception. He walked toward the warehouse entrance, the modified tablet tucked under his arm like a briefcase full of classified secrets. Behind him, invisible federal agents tracked his movement through sniper scopes and surveillance cameras, ready to provide support if the situation deteriorated. The warehouse interior had been dressed to look like an arms dealer's temporary storage facility, with wooden crates labeled in Cyrillic script and canvas-covered objects that suggested military hardware. It was theater designed to convince the broker that he was dealing with a legitimate source rather than walking into a federal trap. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the warehouse as the broker's advance team entered to conduct security sweeps. Marcus positioned himself near a stack of crates, adopting the nervous posture of someone who was having second thoughts about betraying classified information. "You, Rodriguez?" The voice belonged to a man in expensive tactical clothing, with the bearing of someone accustomed to violence but sophisticated enough to avoid unnecessary brutality. Behind him, two other men provided security coverage, while a fourth operated what appeared to be electronic counter-surveillance equipment. "That's me," Marcus replied, allowing tension to creep into his voice. "You got the money?" The man smiled without warmth. "First, we verify the merchandise. My employer doesn't pay for worthless information." Marcus activated the tablet, displaying files that appeared to contain detailed intelligence about smuggling routes, contact information, and operational security procedures. The information was genuine, but carefully selected to avoid compromising ongoing operations, bait sophisticated enough to convince a professional that he was accessing classified military intelligence. "Afghanistan operations 2018 to 2021, Marcus said, adopting the tone of someone who'd practiced this pitch. "Everything your boss needs to restart the networks we shut down. Names, locations, financial connections, transportation routes, worth every penny of what he's paying." The man studied the tablet screen, his expression revealing genuine interest as he recognized the value of the intelligence. "Very impressive, Mr. Rodriguez. My employer will be pleased." "Where is he?" Marcus asked, playing his role as a nervous amateur who wanted to complete the transaction quickly. "I was told he'd be here personally." "He's here," the man replied, gesturing toward the warehouse entrance, where additional footsteps announced new arrivals. "Mr. Rodriguez, allow me to introduce you to someone who's been very interested in meeting you." The figure who entered the warehouse was unremarkable at first glance. Middle-aged, average height, wearing a business suit that could have belonged to any corporate executive. But his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who'd built an empire on violence and betrayal, and his presence seemed to draw energy from the room like a black hole absorbing light. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," the broker said, his accent suggesting Eastern European origins despite decades of international operations. "I've heard so much about your military service. Afghanistan, wasn't it? Such a productive deployment for American intelligence gathering." Marcus felt ice forming in his stomach as he realized that the broker knew far more about his military service than the federal briefings had suggested. This wasn't just about arms smuggling, it was personal, connected to specific operations and specific casualties from his combat deployments. "You've been a difficult man to find," the broker continued, approaching with the confidence of someone who held all the advantages. "6 of your colleagues proved much more cooperative when my associates explained the situation to them." The casual reference to murdered veterans sent rage surging through Marcus's chest, but he forced himself to maintain his cover identity. Around the warehouse, federal agents were listening to every word, gathering evidence that would ensure the broker faced justice for his crimes. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marcus said. "I just want to make the deal and get out of here." The broker laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, Mr. Rodriguez, I think we both know this transaction involves much more than classified intelligence. You see, you and your team didn't just disrupt smuggling operations in Afghanistan. You eliminated my business partners, destroyed my infrastructure, and cost me over $100 million in lost revenue." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. The broker wasn't just an arms dealer trying to rebuild damaged networks. He was the person ultimately responsible for supplying weapons to the insurgents who'd killed American soldiers, the puppet master behind the very operations that Marcus had spent years fighting. "This isn't about money," the broker continued, his mask of civilized behavior finally slipping to reveal the predator underneath. "This is about justice. You destroyed my life's work, Mr. Rodriguez. Now I'm going to return the favor." The warehouse suddenly filled with additional personnel as the broker's security team revealed their true numbers. Instead of the 4 men Marcus had initially counted, at least a dozen armed figures emerged from concealment points throughout the building, all carrying military-grade weapons and moving with professional coordination. "Federal agents!" Agent Chen's voice echoed through the warehouse as the trap finally sprung. "Drop your weapons and surrender." The broker smiled coldly as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, muzzle flashes strobing in the dim warehouse lighting like a deadly fireworks display. His men had come prepared for a fight, turning what should have been a controlled federal operation into a full-scale battle. Marcus dove for cover behind a stack of crates as bullets sparked off concrete and punched through wooden boxes. The tablet containing the classified intelligence flew from his hands, skittering across the warehouse floor toward the broker's position. "So much for careful planning," he muttered, drawing his sidearm and preparing to fight for his life once again. The warehouse erupted into chaos as federal agents engaged the broker's security team in a firefight that shook the building's steel framework. Marcus rolled behind a concrete pillar as automatic weapons fire chewed through his previous cover, splinters of wood and concrete filling the air like deadly confetti. "All units! We are under heavy fire!" Agent Chen's voice crackled through his earpiece over the sound of gunfire. "Suspects came prepared for extended engagement. We've got at least 12 hostiles with military-grade weapons." Through the smoke and muzzle flashes, Marcus could see the broker retreating toward a rear exit, the modified tablet clutched in his hands like a trophy. The man who'd orchestrated the murder of 6 American veterans was about to escape with intelligence that could compromise ongoing operations and endanger more lives. Marcus keyed his radio while suppressing fire from the broker's men, pinned him behind the pillar. "This is Rodriguez. Primary target is moving to the rear exit with the package. Someone needs to cut him off." "Overwatch 2, moving to intercept," Rodriguez's voice replied from his position in the adjacent building. "But I've got multiple hostiles between me and the target." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. What should have been a controlled arrest had become an urban warfare scenario, with federal agents and local police engaged in a running gun battle against professional mercenaries who'd come prepared for exactly this scenario. Suddenly, the distinctive sound of a helicopter approaching at high speed cut through the gunfire. But instead of federal reinforcements, Marcus could see through broken warehouse windows that the aircraft bore no law enforcement markings. It was the broker's extraction vehicle, positioning itself on the building's roof for emergency evacuation. "He's got air support," Marcus transmitted. "Helicopter on the roof. This was planned." The realization that they'd walked into a counter-trap sent adrenaline surging through his system. The broker hadn't just anticipated federal involvement, he'd prepared for it, turning their carefully orchestrated sting operation into his own ambush of American law enforcement. But the broker had made one critical miscalculation. He'd assumed he was dealing with isolated federal agents and local police. He hadn't counted on the brotherhood of veterans who'd sworn to protect Marcus and who were now converging on the warehouse from multiple directions. "Tank, this is Luis." The construction contractor's voice came through Marcus's earpiece, using the civilian radio frequency they'd established as a backup communication channel. "We're moving in from the east with Thompson and Martinez. These bastards want a fight. Let's give them one they'll never forget." Taosiao, through the warehouse's eastern entrance, Marcus could see his veteran brothers advancing in tactical formation, armed with hunting rifles and civilian weapons, but moving with the precision of professional soldiers. They might not have federal authority or military-grade equipment, but they had something more valuable: absolute commitment to protecting their own. The broker's mercenaries suddenly found themselves caught between federal agents attacking from the west and north, and veterans advancing from the east and south. Their tactical advantage evaporated as they were forced to divide their attention between multiple threats approaching from all directions. "Suppressing fire on the north wall?" Rodriguez called out, his rifle cracking steadily as he provided cover for Agent Chen's tactical team. "Federal units advance on my mark." Marcus seized the moment, breaking from cover and moving toward the broker's position near the rear exit. The arms dealer was still clutching the tablet, but his escape route was now blocked by Martinez and Thompson, who'd positioned themselves to cut off access to the roof. "Going somewhere," Marcus called out, his weapon trained on the broker's center mass. The arms dealer turned slowly, his expensive suit torn and stained with concrete dust, but his eyes still burning with the cold intelligence that had built an international criminal empire. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, I must admit I underestimated your resources." "A lot of people make that mistake," Marcus replied, advancing carefully while maintaining his firing position. "Drop the tablet and put your hands where I can see them." Around them, the gunfire was tapering off as the broker's mercenaries realized their position was hopeless. Federal agents were calling for surrender over loudspeakers, while Marcus's veteran brothers maintained overwatch positions that covered every potential escape route. "You think this ends with my arrest?" the broker asked, making no move to comply with Marcus's commands. "I'm just one node in a network that spans continents. There are others who will continue my work, others who will come for you and your friends." "Maybe," Marcus agreed, "but they'll have to get through all of us to do it." The broker's laugh was bitter. "Your brotherhood of broken soldiers. They can't protect you forever, Rodriguez. I've survived wars, revolutions, and government changes. I'll survive this too." "No," Marcus said quietly. "You won't." The final confrontation came not from Marcus, but from Danny, the young Marine who'd appeared at the rear entrance with Thompson's hunting rifle trained on the broker's head. The kid who'd bought boots from Marcus's store, who'd started a new life thanks to a construction job and a chance encounter with kindness, who'd chosen to risk everything to protect the man who'd helped him. "Drop it now," Danny said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was facing. "Or I drop you." The broker looked between Marcus and Danny, calculating odds and assessing escape options. For a moment, Marcus thought the arms dealer might actually surrender, might choose survival over pride, and accept capture by the forces arrayed against him. Instead, the broker smiled and activated something on the tablet, probably a dead man's switch designed to destroy the intelligence if he was killed or captured. But the device Marcus had given him was a federal trap, and the activation signal triggered a GPS locator that would help law enforcement track the criminal network's other operations. "Game over," Agent Chen said, emerging from cover with her weapon trained on the broker. "Drop the device and surrender, or my sniper puts you down where you stand." The helicopter on the roof lifted off without its intended passenger, abandoning the broker to his fate as federal agents closed in from multiple directions. The arms dealer who'd orchestrated the murder of 6 American veterans finally realized that his international criminal empire couldn't protect him from the brotherhood of men who'd sworn to defend their own. As federal agents secured the broker and processed his surviving mercenaries, Marcus found himself surrounded by the veterans who'd risked everything to stand with him. Luis, Rodriguez, Thompson, Martinez, Danny, and half a dozen others who'd answered the call when one of their brothers needed help. "It's over," Agent Chen said, approaching with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just closed a major case. "The broker's network is compromised, his operations are exposed, and the threat to you and the other veterans is neutralized." Marcus nodded, but his attention was focused on the men who'd stood with him, civilians who'd voluntarily returned to war because they understood that some fights were worth the risk. They'd left the military, but they'd never stopped being soldiers when it mattered most. 6 weeks later, Marcus stood in the doorway of his rebuilt military surplus store, watching Danny help a customer select proper boots for a new security job. The bullet holes had been repaired, the damaged merchandise replaced, and the business was thriving again. But more importantly, it had become a gathering place for veterans who understood that service didn't end with retirement. Mrs. Chen appeared at his elbow, offering a cup of tea and a smile that conveyed more than words ever could. "Good customers today," she said, nodding toward Danny and the other veterans who'd become part of their extended family. "The best," Marcus agreed, accepting the tea and the acceptance it represented. The war that had followed him home was finally over, ended not by government agents or federal investigations, but by the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood that connected soldiers across generations and continents. The broker had understood weapons and money and power, but he'd never understood the simple truth that had defeated him in the end. No one fights alone when they're part of something larger than themselves. And Marcus Rodriguez, staff sergeant, store owner, protector of his community, would never be alone as long as his brothers were willing to answer the call. The bell above his door chimed as another customer entered, and Marcus smiled as he prepared to help another veteran find exactly what they needed. Some battles ended in victory, some in defeat, but the war for each other's survival never stopped. And that was exactly how it should be.